Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Here's a question that keeps me awake. Did Jorge Luis Borges ever read the manuscript found in Saragossa by Jan Potocki? Part of me thinks he must have read it, because as you know, Borges read almost everything that is worth reading. But on the other hand, I can tell you for sure that there's not a single line in Borges's works where he mentions this book, and it seems to me that he would have found it impossible to read something like this and not say something about it. In any case, either way, I think The Manuscript Found in Saragossa is a book that is going to delight fans of Jorge Luis Borges and anybody who is interested in the wonderful art of storytelling. This right here is one of my favorite books, and that is the main reason why I would like to explore it with you. The first thing that I'm going to say about it is that this is a very difficult book to categorize. On the one hand, it has been called a novel, and it is that in a way. We have a protagonist who goes from darkness to light, from ignorance to understanding, and maybe even to wisdom. But on the other hand, you also have to say that this is a collection of stories. These stories are all somehow directly or indirectly related to the central character, but at the same time they're also independent stories. Almost as independent as the kind of story that you can find in that first part of Cervantes's Don Quixote. So the back cover description of my edition right here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in a few minutes, touches upon some of the genres that the book covers. It says here, Jan Potocki used a range of literary styles, Gothic, picaresque, adventure, pastoral, erotic, in his novel of stories within stories. That's what I like. A novel of stories within stories. I think that is probably the best way to go about describing and grasping this highly unusual book that is The Manuscript Found in Saragossa. And speaking of unusual, this is a book that is unusual even in its own conception and its publication. That's what I want to explore now, the publication history. The Manuscript Found in Saragossa was originally published in French in the year 1814. Now, some parts of that original text in French were lost, and they only survived in a translation into Polish. And by the way, the author was Polish, so you can see already some interesting things happening here. It was in 1989 that a complete French edition was put together by retranslating those Polish passages back into French. So it's really all over the place. And what we have here, the Penguin edition, which is the one that is most readily available in English, is a translation into English, of course, of that text from 1989 that contains passages that were translated back to French from that Polish translation that survived. The Penguin edition, this translation is by Ian Maclean. I have not read the original, I will say that. Maybe someday I would like to do that, to read the original French. But just judging this by itself, I will say that this is a tour de force. It really, really grabs your attention, and it just drags you into this labyrinth of stories. And I also like about it that it comes with a really nice introduction that is neither too long nor too short, because you really have to appreciate introductions that do not go overboard. And it also has a glossary and a guide to the stories, so that you can explore one or two of the stories if you want. You can follow them. Sometimes they take up many pages, so that is really convenient when it comes to approaching this book as a reader who maybe is not interested in exploring the entire thing, but somebody who wants to focus maybe on one or two of the stories. So I really, really like that part about it. Now, Potocki's book, if we are looking at context here, belongs to a wonderful tradition, because the collection of stories really is an amazing tradition that I am very interested in. We have, for example, Boccaccio's Decameron, right? We have the Canterbury Tales. We have the Tales of Count Lucanor, which is a vastly underrated Spanish classic. I think the words underrated and Spanish almost go together, unfortunately. That's why I have been trying to do my little part in recommending some books of Spanish literature, because I think that Spanish literature itself is just highly underrated. And there's also, of course, a connection with the 1001 Nights. I'm showing you just the first volume here of the 3 volumes of the Penguin edition. I did 6 videos on the 1001 Nights if you're interested. It could have been 1 video, but that's just the way it happens, and that's the way it is. So each of those collections that I have just mentioned, right, from the Decameron to the 1001 Nights, have a frame to them. They have a pretext, if you will, to the text. For example, Boccaccio's storytellers, they are keeping themselves entertained as they are trying to escape the Black Death. Then in the Canterbury Tales, you have people who are going on a pilgrimage to the tomb of Thomas Becket, so they tell stories in order to pass the time. In the Tales of Count Lucanor, what you have is basically stories that the Count hears from his advisor whenever he needs counsel, whenever he is not sure what to do. Now, to me, if you ask me, of all those collections, the one that most closely resembles the manuscript found in Saragossa is the 1001 Nights. And one of the reasons for that is because in these two, the frame that we have is much more solid than in the other collections that I mentioned before. If you remember, in the 1001 Nights, we have Scheherazade, who is telling stories in order to save her life. So to her, this idea of storytelling, of art, really becomes a matter of life or death. So you see what I mean by a more solid type of frame. And also in both of these collections, the 1001 Nights and the manuscript found in Saragossa, you find stories within stories. And that's another great tradition that you can see that these two books subscribe to. This, of course, poses a challenge to the reader. Okay, but don't you like a challenge? I mean, I love literary challenges, and I think that these two are really wonderful. It's difficult to follow the stories at times, but I like that idea, that idea that I cannot start thinking about other things, that I really need to focus on this book. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, when it comes to the structure, both the 1001 Nights and the manuscript found in Saragossa follow the type of matryoshka doll type of structure, where you can find some stories hidden inside the others, and it's like Chinese boxes, it has also been called. So you open one, you find another box, and you keep finding boxes and keep trying to get to the bottom of the mystery of the storytelling. Now there's another genre. Okay, so we talked about the collection of short stories, but there's another genre that must be mentioned when we discuss the manuscript found in Saragossa, and that is the encyclopedic novel, or what in Spanish we call the novela total, so the total novel. These are just very inclusive, I would say even exhaustive books that try to encompass the totality of human experience as far as that is possible to do in a book. So the first example that comes to my mind in the English language would be, of course, James Joyce's Ulysses. The novels of Thomas Pynchon have been mentioned as this type of text, the novels of William Gaddis, the novels of Roberto Bolaño. And of course you can keep adding books to the list, like Rayuela by Julio Cortázar, Life a User's Manual by Georges Perec, Moby Dick, Don Quixote, War and Peace. You get the picture. This is the kind of text that we are talking about, and that's another thing that I appreciate about the manuscript found in Saragossa, this totality, right? This is just another book in which you're going to find basically everything. You find life, you find death, laughter, tears, jealousy, mathematics, religion, sex, all kinds of human beings, all kinds of ghosts too. So it's really a fascinating summary, I would say a summa of the entire human experience. So let me give you a concrete example of this. You're going to find that the book is divided into days, right? So we have 66 days plus an epilogue here. And if you want an example of that eagerness, right, or that impulse for totality that Potocki's book is known for, you can go to day number 49. And there you're going to find the story of a man by the name of Diego Hervas. And what he's doing is he wants to write 100 books. And he says that each one of those books is going to be devoted to a different branch of human knowledge, right? And then the narrator proceeds to tell you about each and every single one of those books, what topic each book is going to cover. So it's basically impossible at that point not to think about Joyce or to think about Perec with this idea of encompassing everything, the idea of totality, or the encyclopedic type of novel, as I called it before. So regarding the contents, okay, I'm going to mention, or I'm just going to comment briefly on the contents of the book, because I feel that otherwise we would end up with a 10-hour video, and I just don't want to try your patience. And another thing that I want to do is to inspire you to read these stories, or this novel, however you want to look at it, hopefully. So the general story that we have here is about a guy by the name of Alphonse van Woerden. He is a young Walloon officer who is basically on his way to Madrid, and he meets meets a series of characters, very interesting characters along the way. These characters interact with him either directly, or they tell him stories. And all of these stories are trying to explain the mysterious events that have been happening in the area. This is an area where we have mystery. And one of the biggest mysteries that we find has to do with two men who are hanging from a gallows. People just keep waking up next to the corpses of these two men, and they just have no idea how they got there. So that is the central mystery that lies at the core of the manuscript found in Saragossa. So you can already see why I say that this is a fascinating text. I mean, who doesn't like an idea like that? To me, the most memorable character was a guy by the name of Juan Avadoro. Mainly, I think, because his story is the longest. It is also the most intricate. It is actually in the story of Juan Avadoro where you find the most of those stories within stories. And I think it's also the most colorful. So look out for the story of Juan Avadoro, or if you decide to read one tale from the manuscript found in Saragossa, maybe you can make it that one, because I think that one is really good. There's also a character by the name of Pedro Velázquez, who is, I would say, unintentionally hilarious. We also meet Ahasuerus, also known as the Wandering Jew, this mythical man, right? This mythical figure who gives us an account, in this case, of his experience with Egyptian religion. So as I said, you can see a vast array of topics in this novel or collection of stories. And some of the stories you're going to find are really meant to titillate the male reader in particular. For example, there's one story in which two sisters and their mother become infatuated with a man who is then invited to stay with them as a lodger. So you can imagine how that continues, right? They play chess, of course. No, they don't. But my favorite stories are not really those, but the stories that contain a supernatural element that may or may not be explained in logical terms, right? They may or may not have a logical explanation. I love ambiguity, as you may know by now, so you can also find that in the manuscript found in Saragossa. And the great example of that would be the story of a man who is asked to keep an eye on a young girl through the window, right? So he is just looking at this girl through the window. So of course you have another male voyeuristic fantasy right here. He eventually marries the girl, okay? But he may only visit her at night. There's always that condition to stories, right? Especially to folk tales, that condition. You can do this, but you can only do it at night, right? Or things like that. Do not go against that. At one point, he goes away on business. He just goes to another place. And when he comes back, he is told that, unfortunately, his wife has passed away. But then that night, he looks through the window and he sees her ghost. I mean, isn't that amazing? That's the kind of story that I like, that type of fantasy. Is there a logical explanation or not? Is there ambiguity? That's the kind of thing that I like, and I found that definitely in Potocki's book. Now, I want to make a note only on the film, okay? And I think that part of the interest in the manuscript found in Saragossa has to do with the fact that this was adapted into a very successful film. It was adapted by Wojciech Has, and it stars this great Polish actor, very well known, Zbigniew Cybulski of Ashes and Diamonds fame. And of course in this movie you can see him without the dark glasses. It's really a fantastic film. Some of the fans of this film are David Lynch, who said this is one mother of a film. Luis Buñuel, one of my favorite directors, was also a fan. He said, I love the Saragossa manuscript. It is exceptional. And you can see a lot of Potocki in the films of Luis Buñuel, actually, in films like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, which has, especially towards the end, that structure of dreams within dreams. So you already have, once again, that matryoshka type of a structure. And also, I think especially in a movie like The Phantom of Liberty, this film that does not really have a protagonist. So even though there is a kind of protagonist in the manuscript found in Saragossa, the novel or the collection of stories, it is not really what I would call a hard protagonist. It's more of a flexible type of protagonist, because you have so many stories that lead you, one of those stories to another, just as you can see in the kind of structure that you find in The Phantom of Liberty, which, by the way, I think is my favorite film by Luis Buñuel. And I like most of his films anyway. I would say all of them, basically. I can't think of a film by Buñuel that I did not like. So I also want to mention this film because there's a passage at one point towards the end of the film past the second hour. Okay, I think it's like towards 2 hours and a half of the film. And I think this passage is just a perfect description of Potocki's book. So let me read that to you. This is once again from the film. One of the characters says, "We are like blind men lost in the streets of a big city. The streets lead to a goal, but we often return to the same places to get to where we want to be. I can see a few little streets here which, as it is now, are going nowhere. New combinations have to be arranged. Then the whole will be clear, because one man cannot invent something that another cannot solve." I just want to share that with you, because I think, once again, that really illustrates this book by Jan Potocki. Bottom line. The manuscript found in Saragossa, as I suggested before, really is a challenge, okay? Even after you read it, you may find yourself in a hard spot when it comes to remembering the details of the stories. At least that's what happens to me. But not only with this book. Every time that I read a collection of short stories, I try to take down notes, because I know that I'm going to forget the details, and I sometimes don't even remember what each of the stories was about. But I would say that this book is wonderful and beautiful, not only because of the stories that it contains, but because it is in itself a wonderful meditation on the very art of storytelling. And that's what I like in particular about this. I love the stories, but I like also the commentary on what it means to tell stories, why we do this, and what does it involve for us as readers, as listeners. If you look at the novel, in the exact midpoint of this book, and I have a thing for midpoints, you know, I always look out for those. Precisely on page 316, we have a very important passage also, just as we did in the movie, in which the characters themselves are commenting on the complexity of the stories that they are listening, which are the stories that we are reading also. So you could say maybe there's a little bit of a a little bit of meta-fiction type of thing, a meta-fictional comment here in the novel. So let me read that to you as a way of concluding this video right here. This is Pedro de Velázquez, the one that I mentioned before, who is speaking right here. And once again, you can find this on page 316. Pedro de Velázquez says, "I have tried in vain to concentrate all my attention on the gypsy chief's words, but I am unable to discover any coherence whatsoever in them. I do not know who is speaking and who is listening. Sometimes the Marqués de Valflorida is telling the story of his life to his daughter. Sometimes it is she who is relating it to the gypsy chief, who in turn is repeating it to us. It is a veritable labyrinth." And that's how I would describe, as a bottom line, the manuscript found in Saragossa. This is a veritable labyrinth, but I can tell you it's a labyrinth that it is just a delight to get lost in. And I enjoyed it very much. Just this idea of just letting the book take you wherever it will. And if that involves getting lost, then so be it. You know, let's just enjoy for the moment that pleasure of being lost in a wonderful literary text. So do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Those are my 2 cents on the manuscript found in Saragossa by Jan Potocki. One of my favorite books, and a book that I hope you will read. And please let me know, if you do, what you think about it. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.